Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today, we will talk about the core elements and principles of research ethics. My name is Rosemary Bernabe, and I work as a professor of research ethics and research integrity at the University of Oslo. So when we talk of basic ethical principles of research ethics, well, our default go-to would be, of course, the research ethics guidelines. So for example, there's guidelines from which is called the Declaration of Helsinki. There's also the SIAMS guidelines. There's the Belmont Report, so on and so forth. And of course, there are a lot of national research ethics guidelines. But more or less, if we do a little survey, on what these guidelines contain, so these guidelines would usually contain the following: the principles, that means what would be the foundation on which the guidelines stand on. Some articles on collaborative partnership, articles on social value, on scientific validity, on fair participant selection, on benefit risk ratio, on independent review, on informed consent, on respect for participants, and articles on vulnerable population as research participants. In this lesson, we will talk about these different sections. So when we think about the ethical issues that may be or must be considered in a study, there are several of them. And we have to remember that when we think of ethical issues, these issues extend from the beginning up to the end. From the beginning, meaning from the time that there's funding, during the design and methodology stage, up to the actual study phase, and then, of course, lastly, after the study or after the trial. Right. So this is an example of just some of the ethical issues that we should have to think about, consider, or encounter at the beginning, during, and then after a study, right? So at the funding, design, and methodology stage, we have to already think who would be the participants. Would these participants be considered vulnerable? Are there issues of exploitation I have to consider? How about the value of this research for the community, for the participants themselves? Is this something that they need? Or am I doing this out of convenience? That's what we mean by responsiveness and social value. Am I including placebo in my trial, or am I following standard of care? But which standard am I following? Of course, even at the earliest point, you have to think of risk-benefit assessment. So we will look into all of these later on. But risk-benefit assessment simply means that the benefits. The risk should not outweigh the benefits, and of course, you would want in the best scenario that the benefits always outweigh risks, right? And of course, you'd have to think of the requirements of ethical approval, including informed consent, so on and so forth. And maybe not many people think about this, but at the early stage, researchers and research funders should already think of post-study plans. What do you do after the study? What are your responsibilities as researchers after the study? Now, during the study, you would have to think of course, gathering informed consent and doing it in the best possible way. Of course, in an ethically justifiable manner. Adequate protection of rights and welfare of the research participants. Think of adverse events. What do you do? What is the protocol for that? Is there a sufficient protocol that has to do with the protection of safety of rights and welfare? Ancillary care obligations. We will see what it means as we move along. Now there's again risk-benefit assessment, because you cannot just do risk-benefit assessment before the start of the study. This has to be continuously done, right? Because it's possible that that as the study progresses, the risk-benefit ratio starts to change, which then, of course, affects the ethical justifiability of the study, right? And of course, all throughout there must be ethics oversight. Now, after the study has been completed, after the successful completion of a study, then researchers and research funders and other stakeholders, such as, for example, research regulators, would have to think of post-study obligations, right? Now, there are two perspectives. There's fair benefits and reasonable availability, and we will discuss the difference between these, in this course as well. All throughout, from the beginning up to the end, there should always be considerations of respect for participants and community collaboration. We will go through each single section here. First, let's see what we mean, or let's discuss what we mean by principles. Yeah, so guidelines have principles. Principles refer to, or by principles it refers to the foundation that allows you to make some sort of an ethical justification for the requirements, right? Now, there are two big principles that are common in the guidelines. So some guidelines would be more deontological in approach, and this is represented by the quote I have here: "The interests and welfare of the participants shall prevail over the sole interests of society or science." But there's also what we call principles approach. Yeah. So principles approach means that there are principles, none of them have primacy over the other, and ethical justification has to do with balancing these principles against each other. Now, the most famous of them all would be what we see, for example, in the work of Beauchamp and Childress, yeah, and eventually in the Belmont Report. So the four principles would be autonomy, that means respect for persons, that each individual is capable of self-governing. There's beneficence, that means benefit, right? Non-maleficence, that means do no harm, or at least, conversely, in research, we also call it risks and burdens or inconveniences. And of course, justice. And when applied to the research ethics setting, by justice, we refer to fairness in distribution of burdens and harms. It means who you choose to be research participants as opposed to who stands to benefit because of the study. Right. So, and some guidelines combine the deontological approach with the principles approach, right? So you would see some guidelines containing statements on referring to the interest welfare of the research participants, having primacy over the sole interest of society or science. At the same time, also mentioning some sort of principles, to in the process of or that can be used for ethical justification. Now, these are just examples of how these two approaches, are used in specific guidelines. So one, we have UNESCO's Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, the deontological approach. You see it in Article 3. Human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms are to be fully respected. The interests and welfare of the individual should have priority over the sole interest of science or society. Right. So that's an example. For the principles approach, we have the Belmont Report. It states as follows: 3 basic principles among those generally accepted in our cultural tradition are particularly relevant to the ethics of research involving human subjects: the principles of respect of persons, beneficence, and justice. So just to keep in mind, so when you're reading guidelines, don't just go into the articles giving you some directions on specific issues. Just see what foundations support the guideline. Yeah, so somehow it tells you why the guideline is written in such a manner. Now, guidelines also talk about collaborative partnerships. And when we talk of collaborative partnerships, there are in fact 2 themes. First is community collaboration. And then there's also collaboration between the external sponsor and the host countries. So first will be community collaboration. What do you mean by community collaboration? It refers to how researchers reach out to the community from which the research participants come from, and how they work together on parts of the research, right? Whether, for example, consulting them on informed consent, consulting them on how best to distribute information about the study to the community, or maybe even going beyond that, such as, for example, really consulting them about certain aspects of the protocol that the researcher might find the inputs of the community useful. You see, so then community members can really have several functions, not only as research participants, but also as consultants. But also when we talk of collaborative partnerships, and that's the second bullet point, collaboration with the external sponsor and the host countries. Right, so especially in this applies to studies that are where the external sponsor does not belong to or is not based in the host country. Yeah. So think of intercontinental clinical trials or multi-country clinical trials. Right. So there has to be collaboration, obviously. So usually if the trial is done by a pharmaceutical company which is based in Europe, in the US, in Japan, or some other countries, they do these clinical trials outside outside their home country, and they do it out. And these countries where they do their clinical trials in would be what we call the host countries. Now, when we talk about collaboration between the external sponsor and the host countries, there's several things we have to think about, and you can immediately see that those involved cannot simply be just the community and the external sponsor, right? Included in the layer will be regulatory stakeholders. You would include the regulators. You would include the ethics committees, right? You would also include, for example, a local PI. Local principal investigator. You might also talk about the local research group, the local CRO, so on and so forth. There's several layers once we start talking about large-scale clinical trials, multi-country clinical trials, and that very complex system, this very complex dynamic, right? Speaks also of a certain type of collaboration. Now, of course, as we've said, we want such collaboration to be fair, for not only the researchers, the local researchers, and of course the foreign researchers, but most especially for the communities who will be receiving, or who will be from where the research participants will be coming from. And this becomes really a big discussion in the literature. As mentioned a while ago, when we talk of community collaboration, if research participants, or shall we say participants from the community, can collaborate in different ways. They can be sources of data, that is when they simply become research participants, but they can also be expert consultants. That means that they are also consulted on certain parts, or if not all, and if not the entirety of the research, such as, for example, consulting them about informed consent, about communication dissemination measures, or even how certain things ought to be done in the research. They can be collaborators, meaning that they can think, for example, of citizen scientists. So they are not just expert consultants. They also become part of the research group. What I will show you examples of citizen science in a short while. And then lastly, they can be decision makers. Think of patient organizations that are also funders, right? So many different layers when you talk about community collaboration. This is an example of citizen science. So by citizen science, it refers to the practice of public participation and collaboration in scientific research. So here you'd see students test water quality. And this is from the National Geographic. Here are more examples, and there are a lot of examples of citizen science research activities. Yeah. So the example we saw a while ago, it it's part of the World Monitoring Day research, where a test kit is sent to citizens in different parts of the globe, to test the quality of their water, and of course send results from that to the main researcher or research group. Another one is Search Space, where participants may volunteer by searching images for tiny interstellar dust impacts. Obviously, you'd need some kind of how do you call it? Some kind of equipment to do that. Frog and toad populations, bird watching, etc., etc. There's so many ways that that now citizens are not only they not only act as a base from which you get research participants, but also as actual researchers, calling them or naming them what we call citizen scientists. Okay? Next, after thinking of collaborative partnerships, you also have to think of social value. And when we talk of social values, at least based on ethical guidelines, guidelines speak of social value in three ways. First is responsiveness. What do you mean by responsiveness? Responsiveness means that the research agenda or the research objective responds to a need of the community or the host country. Now guidelines also speak about social value in resource poor settings. So if research is done by, for example, researchers from high-income countries and they go to low-income countries or low and middle-income countries, so what is the social value of this research for them? So that means it's not only would they have a need for the therapeutic product that's being investigated, but would it also contribute to, for example, a capacity building? So will it also contribute to providing more knowledge about a topic that is important to the research participants and the community, or maybe even the host country, right? And last is what we call reasonable availability. So it's one thing to say that the research is responding to a need, and it's quite another to say, well, what then happens afterwards, right? So it might respond to a need, but if the results of the research do not go back to the host country, then there's almost no point in doing it, right? So these are three things that are probably to think about when we think of social value. Yeah. So I will give you some examples. So we said a while ago that when we say social value, there must be some sort of reasonable availability, right? It comes back to the community. Look at this. This is based on the COVID experience. So more or less a year and a half after vaccines were out and available, market available, you see the distinction between the number of doses that have been served with at least one dose of the vaccine. So in high-income countries, that will be the one on the left side, as opposed to low-income countries. Okay? So 72% as opposed to 17 or 18%. That's a huge gap, right? And that tells us that a lot of things need to be done, in bridging this gap, and bridging this gap of access. Another example, this is from the latest, or shall we say, the 2022 version of the Access to Medicines Index. Here we see, so we talked about responsiveness a while ago, right? It responds to a need. And we also talked about the social value to resource poor settings, right? So here we see an example. R&D, research and development pipeline, empty for most emerging infectious diseases. So you would see how many research and development projects there are for for emerging infectious diseases, and how many companies are actively working on the research and development, and you see a lot of zeros there. Right, so it seems that a lot of work really needs to be done, to address not only reasonable availability, but also responsiveness, but also social value to resource poor settings. And here is another example, also coming from Access to Medicines Index 2022. 2/3 of product scope of this analysis, and I will tell you what they mean by this analysis, are not covered by any access strategies in low-income countries. So Access to Medicines Index asks each pharmaceutical company that you see in front of you, ask for 10 samples of products that they have clinical trials on in low-income countries, right? And then they've also asked, are there agreements to make this product available in the host country after the trial, right? So that's it wasn't even so you see that the bar is actually very low. Will you make it available to the low income country after the trial? I mean, first maybe after 1 or 2 years after the successful clinical trial and after it has gained marketing approval. Will you make it available to them? Is there some kind of an agreement? We're not even talking about equitable pricing here. We're simply talking about making the products available, right? And you'd see that many of these pharmaceutical companies don't even have such an agreement. Yeah? Note that the companies were the ones who provided the 10 examples. So they must have chosen the best examples that they have. And in spite of that, most of the products were not covered by an access strategy. Yeah. Okay. This is an example from our study done on post-trial access in clinical trials, a study done in the Philippines. So as you would see, so what's interesting about this is it tells you how there's a lot of misunderstanding on what post-trial access means, but also on how there's barely any kind of post-trial access, right? So researchers, so this is based on the protocols and the dossiers received by the Research Ethics Committee from the University of the Philippines. And research, and in that dossier we examined, if researchers declared post-trial access, and if they did, in what form. Yeah, and so several of them said yes. I think around 50% of the dossiers declared having post-trial access. But if you look into what they mean by post-trial access, you would see that there's barely any kind of real information or even understanding of what it means, right? So see what first, how is post-trial access available? It says during study access to study drug. That's not post-trial access. That's simply part of the protocol. Post-trial access refers to option to transfer to open label extension study. That's just also not post-trial access. That means transferring research participants to another study. Post-trial access because the drug will eventually be available in the market, but that's not simply what it means, right? It means what happens to research participants after the study, even before marketing authorization, especially for research participants who showed that they can in fact benefit from this drug. Next, unknown benefit owing to experimental nature, which means there's really no plan. Evaluated by sponsor depending on patient need. That means, well, it depends if the sponsor will provide it. Study will not have post-trial access after researchers declaring that they have post-trial access. And then next is standard of care outside of trial, which again is not post-trial access because this simply means depending on the national healthcare system, right? And very lastly, which probably is the most credible of all the responses, post-trial access referring to access to results or information. So as you can see, these are all clinical trials on therapeutic interventions referring to drugs, but none of them actually spoke of a clear-cut plan, a clear-cut response on how to make the intervention itself, available to the host, to the research participants, to the community, or the host country. The most that they're able to provide is some kind of availability of information. Okay. Next is scientific validity. So just the word itself, scientific validity, because we know that a study that is not done scientifically is also unethical because it's a waste of resources. It's a waste. It exposes participants to unnecessary risks and burdens, so on and so forth. Right. So so at least the study design and protocol, these are all somehow dictated by the requirements of the field, right? The same thing goes with professionalism, though, referring to qualification and competence, skills, and care of those involved. You know, so you would not make a you would not make somebody who does not specialize in cancer lead a study on cancer, for example. But then it can also be very mundane, such as think of well, one example. We did a study on the types of ethical issues that happen on pivotal clinical trials done in Europe that were discovered by inspectors. And one funny incident was in one of the clinical trials done in a middle-income country, the PI, who is a medical doctor, hired his wife, who is not a nurse, to be an attending nurse in the study. That's obviously lack of professionalism, right? Now, still within scientific validity is the issue of placebo. Should researchers in clinical trials use placebo, and when are they allowed to, or when can they use placebo? Well, generally, rule of thumb seems to say that placebo may be used when no proven interventions exist, if there's no other option. No, but then you see, what do we mean by when no proven intervention exists is actually very tricky, right? Because then, as I will show you, we have the whole issue of standard of care. So by standard of care, this refers to the baseline against which other treatment regimes or regimens can be compared. There is, for each particular medical condition, a set of recognized treatments and care interventions that constitute the present standard of care for that condition. Yeah, so now the question is standard of care something international? That means in any part of the globe, the standard of care remains the same? Or is the standard of care something that is country dependent? So, for example, if there is no think of any disease. So, if treatment is available, and accessible in a high-income country and not accessible in a low-income country, would we now say that there are two standards of care? And why does this matter? Right? Going back. Placebo may be used when no proven interventions exist, but exists where? Exists throughout the world, or in that, or only in particular settings, right? So continuing some statements of standard of care and research participation should not cause predictable harm by deprivation of known effective treatment. It would be against the researchers' professional obligations as medical doctors to treat any of their patients in a way that is not in the patient's best interest. Then, see, the question of standard of care keeps on coming up. What do we mean by treating? Which standard should we use when we talk about treating research participants? Not making sure that they're not caused by predictable harm. If in low-income countries, standard of care is nothing because they have no access for it and are not able to purchase it, would research participants from low-income countries can they now be justifiably be exposed to more risks because standard of care there is nothing? See, so there are real ramifications, to how we define a standard of care when we talk about use of placebo. Now, if the standard of care in low-income countries is nothing, does that mean, therefore, that if placebo cannot be used in high-income countries because they have access, then placebo may be used in low-income countries because they have no access to that particular intervention? Just some statements from the Declaration of Helsinki. It is the duty of the physician to promote and safeguard the health, well-being, and rights of patients, including those who are involved in medical research. The physician's knowledge and conscience are dedicated to the fulfillment of this duty. You see how this all rings very true. At the same time, not resolving the issue of a double standard when it comes to standard of care that we were discussing just a while ago. Now, still retaining or going to the issue of the use of placebo, and this comes from the 2013 Declaration of Helsinki. Helsinki states the following: the benefits, risks, burdens, and effectiveness of a new intervention must be tested against those of the best proven interventions, what we've said a while ago, except in the following circumstances. So the 2013 version of Helsinki provides exceptions when placebo may be used. Yeah. So it says where no proven intervention exists, and the or is here the most important thing, where for compelling and scientifically sound methodological reasons, the use of any intervention less effective than the best proven one, the use of placebo, or no intervention is necessary to determine the efficacy or safety of an intervention. And the patients who receive any intervention less effective than the best proven one, placebo, or no intervention, will not be subject to additional risks of serious or irreversible harm as a result of not receiving the best proven intervention. So initially we said that placebo may be used if no proven interventions exist, and we were already questioning what do you mean by no proven intervention exists where, internationally or nationally? That was our whole discussion on standard of care, right? But then now the Declaration of Helsinki even provides more reasons or more justifications on the use of placebo. It says, well, okay, but even if intervention exists, you can still use placebo or no intervention at all if there are compelling and scientifically sound methodological reasons. That means any scientific reason is plausible for the 2013 version of the Declaration of Helsinki, so long as the participants will not be exposed to additional risks of serious or irreversible harm. Now, I would want to challenge you on that. What do you think of this requirement? Do you think this is ethically justifiable? Right. All right. So just to see how complex this question of use of placebo in clinical trials is. So here you have information on phase 4 clinical trials using placebo. Why is this an issue? So phase 4 trials are supposed to be are trials done after marketing authorization, right? So it's done on an intervention with a certain amount of proven safety and efficacy, right? So this means that now if you use placebo in a phase 4 trial, it means that you have at least 2 arms, one using a drug with a proven a safety and efficacy profile, and another one with placebo. Now that immediately starts sending red flags, right? So unless we're talking about psychotropic drugs with with looming issues of assay sensitivity, for example, it's so difficult to justify the use of placebo versus a drug with known with the known or acceptable safety and efficacy profile, such as, of course, all the marketed drugs that we have. Now, so the whole issue of use of placebo in clinical trials is very complex, not only in terms of like it being done in low and middle income countries or low and middle income country settings, but also in how they're just randomly used in trials such as phase 4 trials, where the goal should be more clinical applications than it is testing a drug, right? So, okay. All right. Now we go to the next topic, which is fair participant selection. So research participant selection should be based on two things. I mean, how do we choose research participants? It should be based on two things. First would be scientific norms, and second, the likelihood of generating valid and reliable data. So you can see here, convenience is not a factor in choosing research participants. Just because it's convenient to have them as research participants doesn't mean that they have to be doesn't mean that you have to enroll them. If science allows it, and if getting research participants from this population will generate valid and reliable data at the same time convenient for you, that's okay. But convenience cannot be and should not be the primary reason for the choice of research participants. Why am I saying this? Well, and I'm not, and by saying this, I'm not thinking about research, those small research projects done by students. Like students really make a lot of mistakes here and there. That's why they're called students. They need a lot of coaching. They need a lot of guidance. But when we look into the clinical trials going on right now, there's a lot of offshoring of clinical trials, large and like a heavily funded clinical trials. A lot of them are offshored where? In low and middle income country settings. And why is that? Is it because they are addressing grave need? As we saw a while ago, there are a lot of tropical diseases that are yet to be addressed to have any kind of R&D on them. So obviously that's not the reason. Several studies show that part of the reason is in fact convenience, right? It's convenient because then you have a lot of treatment naive patients. Regulators in low and middle income countries, because they want these clinical trials in their countries, because this becomes some sort of healthcare in countries that need some kind of more access to healthcare. So regulators are more are more ready to make leeway, for trials. There are also infrastructure. There's already infrastructure in low and middle income countries for clinical trials, and you also have a lot of specialists already who can be PI and who can be part of the research group. And of course, largely and generally, a very important aspect is that it's most of the time much cheaper to do it in low and middle income countries than it is in high income countries. So I mean, it's well and good if doing these clinical trials refers to it's actually they're done because of responsiveness concerns and because of concerns for benefit sharing. But we have reasons to doubt that. We have reasons to believe that most of these trials are done primarily because of convenience, and secondarily, if at all, because of reasons of responsiveness. Yeah. Okay. Just to go through what Helsinki says about fair participant selection, groups that are underrepresented in medical research should be provided appropriate access to participation and research. And physicians who combine medical research with medical care should involve their patients in research only to the extent that this is justified by its potential preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic value. And if the physician has good reason to believe that participation in the research will not adversely affect the health of the patients who serve as research subjects. Right. So Article 14 points to the need for due diligence of the physicians who combine medical research with medical care. Um, so making sure that there's sufficient ethical justification for the involvement of research participants, but also enough safeguards when it comes to the health and well-being of the research participants, right? At the same time, Article 13 talks about making sure that those that are underrepresented in medical research are provided appropriate access to participation in research, right? So, and this is also an important point because then we see here, for example, analysis of racial ethnic representation in select basic and applied cancer research studies. So if you look into the final sentence of this paragraph, it says these results clearly indicate a need to diversify oncological studies to other populations, along with novel strategies to enhance race, ethnicity, data recording, and reporting. And so you can see how this is important, right? So cancer affects not only individuals in not only the white population, but also, well, all other people from different of different races, right? So then, of course, you would need cancer research to also include participants that represent the other races as well. Right now, yeah, you might start to think, well, does this affect fair selection of research participants? And how about the question of benefits? How about the issue of that we were talking about a while ago of going in low and middle income country settings? Shouldn't they also be represented? Yes, they should be represented, of course, as we saw. But then the inclusion of cancer patients, the inclusion of people in low and middle income countries should always be, it should be done not because it's convenient to do it. If convenience is there, that's good, but it should be done primarily because you want to respond to their need, right? So you see two different intentions. If it's done primarily to respond to a need, then that's wonderful. Then that has to be an important priority. If with it comes some kind of convenience, then I wouldn't have any problem. Yeah, but so long as we see the gap we saw a while ago, having a lot of neglected diseases still remain to be neglected, while clinical trials done in low and middle income countries are increasing in number, then we do have really a real prioritization problem here. All right, so thank you very much for listening.